Hello, my name is Carolina and I am here at the beautiful Purple Valley Yoga Center once again. This time I'm here together with Ty Landrum that is teaching at Purple Valley for the third time, and it has been a great retreat. And today I was thinking that we are going to talk about Prana and Apana, two elements that are quite visible in Thai's teaching. But before we start the conversation, I just wanted to read a short little text from a book by Swami Niryananda Saraswati, which is called Prana and Pranayama, and it's from the Bihar School of Yoga. And this short sequence is about universal prana. So at the very beginning, there was nothing, not even creation. What existed was an all-pervasive and manifested consciousness, known in the scriptures as Para-Brahman. It contained within it all the qualities and components necessary for creation. The whole universe lay infinitely contracted in it as mere potency. Prana remained completely absorbed in it, as if in a union of deep embrace. It was a state of perfect equilibrium and harmony. And in this utter stillness, there is a movement. The tantric and Vedic literature state that the desire arose in the absolute principle, Ekoham Bahusyam, I am the one, let me become many. The desire in the first creative impulse which results in willing. The willing of the unmanifest consciousness causes the first spandan, the first vibration, and energy issues forth. It is the first movement, the first moment of becoming from being, the first manifestation of prana. And how do we put prana into context when it comes to our practice of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, Ty?
Well, I mean, you know, as this very beautiful, philosophical image that you just described for us suggests. Prana is something absolutely fundamental and elemental to our existence. It's the sort of creative dynamism behind everything that manifests. So everything that we encounter in the phenomenal world and everything perhaps that we don't encounter but that's sort of stirring beneath the surface. So it's dynamism in both its manifest and its sort of potential but stirring forms. That's what prana is. So, though prana might, sound like, something that one might be skeptical of, because one might think that it refers to some sort of invisible force that doesn't necessarily have any explanatory utility. I think it's quite difficult to sustain skepticism about prana when you just understand that it refers in a very general and somewhat simple and elegant way to all creative dynamism itself. So all prana is the energy behind movement, and in every form of energy that we might talk about. Or that we might refer to and trying to understand things, or that we might experience directly, is a kind of prana.
Yeah. So Hatha Yoga Pradipika in the second chapter, verse 2 says, when prana moves, chitta, or consciousness, moves. And when prana is without movement, chitta is without movement. It means that in case the energy is completely still, then our mind will be completely still. So how is this in correlation to each other? How is this basically combined?
Well, so the idea here is that prana and apana, they somehow move together, you know, and so it's sometimes said that they move together like two birds flying in formation. Which is the same kind of image, but it also, I think that's a slightly richer idea because it tells us that it isn't simply that if prana is still, then mind is still, and if prana is in motion, that the mind is in motion, that chit, consciousness, is in motion, but rather that if prana is in a sort of agitated and distracted and limited state, then so will the experience of one's chit, so will the experience of mind. So you might think if I suppose that what you're asking is sort of like, how do these concepts relate to, Ashtanga practice, the kinds of practices that we do? Well, we can think of those practices as being designed, among other things, to sort of open up the pathways through which the prana can move. And in doing that, we sort of break these limiting patterns that condition the movements of prana. And those conditioned patterns just are the conditioned patterns of our thoughts, of our emotions, of our perceptions. And so by breaking these patterns and allowing these creative forces to move through us in a more expansive way, we expand our consciousness, in the sense that we expand our perceptual capacities. We're able to see things from greater points of view. We are able to experience a wider variety of emotions, and perhaps we don't sort of get caught in repetitive cycles of emotion as much in a harmful way. Yeah. So there's also this very nice, one thing that we might call attention to in that very first image that you read about this moment where a certain urge, a certain will, a certain desire arises from the absolute, sort of prior to any creative manifestation, and that just is, as you read it there in that sort of Upanishadic language, I am one, now I become many. There's this urge of reality to suddenly, of consciousness, let's say, to suddenly fracture itself, and so to experience itself from a diversity of different angles, and an endless diversity of different angles and so forth. And that there's an idea that runs through yoga that desire is the primitive desire, and that every other desire is a sort of a more or less confused or limited instantiation of that. But what it means is that same urge for experiencing our own inherent creative potential from an endless diversity of perspectives is the deepest desire of our own heart. Yeah. And so whatever our sort of expressed motives might be for coming to yoga, the idea is that ultimately this desire of the heart is what's driving us. And so we can bring our motives sort of more into alignment with that primitive urge of the heart for intimacy with reality, for intimacy with the spontaneous expression of its own creative potential. So through reflection, and through through sort of cultivating a certain kind of clarity. Yeah.
So do you think that the Ashtanga practice somehow can help us to clear the channels, the pranic channels that we have in our body?
I do.
And do you think that it can be cleaned by or improved by the asana practice, or are there any other practices within the Hatha Yoga that are also improving the prana?
I do.
Body?
Absolutely. I think that Ashtanga Vinyasa is an extremely potent method for sort of opening these subtle pathways through which prana can move. It's not a sort of automatic. On some levels, it can work in a sort of automatic way, but one can't practice Ashtanga Vinyasa or any other kind of yoga sort of mechanically. But it's something that has to sort of quicken and fully involve one's intelligence, one's intention, one's desire. It takes full sort of, it sort of demands increasing presence of awareness. And when you bring a sharp and refined sense of awareness and a refined sort of sensibility to that process of moving prana through unwalked pathways, let's say, then things really start to open up. I mean, the mind can really, the mind wants to expand into these other places of consciousness. It wants to do that, and if you're attentive to that and you practice with that kind of movement in view, then it does happen. Yeah.
You mentioned intention of the practice.
Yeah.
So what is your intention with your practice?
Well, I mean, I think my intentions for practicing have really transformed a lot over the years.
In which way?
I mean, my sense of what I was doing initially is really remarkably different from what it has been in other times and what it is now. Anecdotally, I got into yoga because I was struggling with depression about 15 years ago, and I heard it would help. And I was kind of at the point where I was ready to try anything. So I wasn't particularly intrigued by yoga because the images that I had of what yoga was were all, sort of popular images of, and so I guess in my very judgmental mind, I thought that yoga was a sort of charade of false spiritualism, and that it used sort of cheap tricks of visceral exhilaration in order to confuse people into thinking that something interesting was happening psychologically in their minds. And but I went to such a dark place that I was starting to surrender in a really big way, because I'd sort of hit rock bottom with the depression. It had been, I don't know, maybe 8-9 years of depression, and so that had gotten increasingly worse to the point where I was just, I was ready to give up all my judgments, and that's a really potent place to start yoga, because there's a certain kind of openness, a certain just surrender of preconception, and a sort of genuine receptivity to whatever the potency of the practice might be. So since then, I'm not stalked by depression anymore. I don't struggle with it. It's been, 7 years or so, although there was no definite moment when I could say, well, that was the day that I woke up and the depressive thoughts weren't stalking me anymore. But if I look back, I can look back into the past about 7 years and see that, well, that I wasn't stalked by those same patterns of thinking. And then, prior to that, it starts to sort of fade back in and sort of get thicker and darker until I move all the way back to that first year of practice. So, in the beginning, it was really about managing those depressive states, and it worked. It didn't work quickly, but it worked in a way that there was some part of me that sort of understood that that I could be radically transformed through this process if I really surrendered to it. Something in me knew that, although in the beginning it actually got worse. And I think a lot of people have that experience, especially people who struggle with anxiety and depression, because when you first start doing yoga, all that stuff comes up to the surface.
And I have to interrupt you.
Yeah, sorry.
And why do you think it is coming up to the surface?
Why is it coming to the
Is
surface?
it because you are actually managing to face yourself on the mat?
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to this idea of prana. It's moving your prana And so it's sort of moving your defenses and, you know, softening your clutches to your your repetitive patterns of suppression. And so that, you know, sort of opens you up in a certain way, and you suddenly feel everything that you were, you know, trying so desperately to keep below the surface. And so that all comes up and just kind of unfolds right before you. And that's a very difficult moment, but you know, I'm now convinced that there's no other way. You know, that any form of therapy or yoga that you might do, it has to go through that phase of the process where you fully, utterly, completely have to sort of, you know, be flooded by whatever kinds of emotions or difficult memories you are suppressing, and, you know, fully engage those as a way of you know, of ultimately letting them go and releasing the energy that's inside of them, and you know, learning how to relate differently to those memories.
So when we are coming into Ashtanga, when we are coming to any form of physical Hatha yoga practices, we usually start with the Asana practice. So how do you think that this is affecting the emotional level or the pranic levels in the body? The asana, like the
Yeah,
asana
well, I
practice
mean, I do think
the
that
blockages.
we, you know, and I think this just, you know, mostly from visceral experience, that we sort of store different emotions in our bodies, and those are sort of areas where prana is kind of entangled, or it's sort of, you know, it's congealed, it's condensed in a certain way. The prana is not flowing through that place in the body. And so when we start to sort of move and breathe into that place and get prana to move more freely through that place, then the sort of memories and emotions that are being suppressed on that visceral level are released. They're released through that. And so there's this sort of cathartic or potentially cathartic moment where those things are suddenly brought to the surface, and then everything depends on what happens next. You know, if you sort of, you know, if you tense around those experiences in your usual habitual way, or you judge yourself, or you impose your preconceptions and your ideas and your narrative storylines back on that experience, it simply reinforces the same patterns of thought and speech and action that are at issue. But if one learns to sort of hold a space of open and compassionate receptivity to that experience, then those emotions, it's sort of like, you know, and of course all of this is metaphor, but there's no other way to talk about it, right? Because it's internal. But it's sort of like those emotions can't entangle themselves in the body if you're not tensing around them in any way. So if the breath is just moving fluidly and you're continuing to soften into the experience, then that energy, because the prana moves, that's what it does, right? So suddenly you are holding some prana in place. Suddenly you let it go, it moves through your consciousness. If you just let it move, it's just going to transform and release its energy. And then that energy, you experience that as a sort of pure exhilaration, a sort of, you know, like you can get chills on the skin, and suddenly, you know, you might have a sense of heightened perceptual awareness. Like suddenly you can hear more sharply, you can see more sharply in an instant, you know, in the middle of the practice. And that is the prana, the creative force, being released from this psychological entanglement and returning back to the subtle body. And the subtle body becomes stronger this way. It said that the subtle body sort of lights up and becomes more radiant through that, you know, through that process, which is called hatha peka, by the way, which means sudden, sudden absorption. Like you're finally absorbing back into the subtle body the creative force that you are holding on a more visceral level as unprocessed thought or emotion or memory. So
Now when I have been participating in your classes, you talk very much about there has to be a balance between apana
Yeah.
and prana, because
Yeah.
you can become a little bit too pranic.
Sure. I mean, we swing through the two poles of prana and apana in ordinary consciousness. It's just what we do. So prana is the expansive force. It's the force that is, exhibited in the jungle all around us here by the sort of upward and outward branching of the foliage. Because prana is ultimately movement, like I said, it's dynamism. Prana has this sort of diversifying, pluralizing, multiplying, branching kind of pattern. And apana has a contractive pattern. It's just the opposite. And it roots down, and if you could see down below the earth, you'd see the aponic force sort of rooting down into the soil in all of these trees, sort of tethering them to the earth and allowing them to release things back into the earth that are unwanted through the roots. So prana is the sort of creative movement, and apana is the dissolutive movement, the one that dissolves things, the one that clears space, right? And so, I mean, there's a lot that can be said here, but basically, if prana and apana are also the animating forces behind the breath. And as we know, inhaling and exhaling, these are sort of mutually supportive processes. You really can't have one without the other. So prana and apana similarly are intertwined, and you can think of apana as the sort of space within which prana can spread out its currents, right? But the exhale pattern, the apana, in sort of dispelling excess from the body and the mind, if it becomes unbalanced from its pranic opposite, it can result in a kind of rigidity, a sort of fixedness, a stubbornness, even a brittleness. And so, this is kind of an aponic posture that I'm taking here. And if prana is unbalanced by its opposite, it can become sort of too etheric, too airy, too ungrounded. So that can be associated with a sort of overactive imagination, and in more extreme cases, with schizophrenia and with other kinds of disorders that have to do with, sort of severe delusion. So, but when these forces are in balance, then they sort of start to exhibit their best qualities. So when apana is balanced and filled by prana, then it's a sort of openness. It's a sort of clearing. It's our ability to let things go. Apana underlies that ability. Our ability to let things just sort of dissolve into emptiness. Our ability to make space for things. And then when prana is balanced by its opposite, it's receptivity and it's imagination and the ability to see things from multiple points of view. And if you're grounded in that, of course, then you can be extraordinarily creative because you have the centeredness and the groundedness to sort of stay focused in your creative endeavors. And so you can, manifest your creative inspirations.
So how can we work towards balancing both apana and
well,
prana?
I mean,
is the practice automatically balancing it?
The practice is designed specifically to balance prana and apana. That's sort of what it's all about. This is the way that that Krishnamacharya and others thought of these practices, and when they're putting them together, they thought precisely of how to balance prana and apana. And our alignment instructions when we work in Ashtanga Vinyasa are all about feeling the interpenetration of these expansive and contractive forces, that we're not just oscillating between them, but finding the ways that these two patterns express in the body and staying connected with the sort of elements of posture that represent that represent the opposite pattern when we give another pattern an expression. So if we're expressing the prana pattern, we stay connected to the aponic elements of the posture. When we're more expressing an aponic pattern, then we stay connected with the pranic elements of the posture, so that we're never swinging completely from one pole to another. And this has the effect of, I mean, once we develop some skill and proficiency with, not with the asanas themselves, but with this internal practice of using asana to balance prana and apana. And you don't have to be particularly flexible or strong in order to do that. You do have to have a refined body awareness, and then it's a cultivated ability. But when you do refine that ability to balance prana and apana within your body, it holds you in this state of grounded, balanced receptivity. And it is precisely that state that allows you to experience unprocessed thought, emotion, and memory, and to sort of, stay in a place of equanimity, but also of interest, so that so that you can attend to those emotions, but not tense around them, but simply allow them to trace through the space of your awareness and release their psychical energy. So that's where the cathartic process really becomes potent and full, right? And you would ask me, I mean, just to finish up on a question that you had asked me before, is sort of like, well, what, how have your motives or intentions for the practice changed with time? Well, certainly, one might use yoga to, initially to sort of manage anxiety and depression, right? But once one gets beyond that and one starts to experience, genuine, mental health, one realizes that there are many, many levels of mental health that go far beyond what we think of as ordinary, psychological well-being. They go far, far beyond that. And yoga really has its purpose in exploring those, supramundane states of consciousness in which we come into a more lucid appreciation for the interconnectedness of all beings. And to feel that interconnectedness, to develop a genuine animating compassion, and to be sort of, guided through life by a lucid sense of that connection is, what sort of draws me out and draws me to passionately practice Ashtanga Vinyasa every day.
And do you think that everyone can develop a different state of consciousness through the practice?
So it's said, yeah, it's said that these states of consciousness are not the exclusive property of anyone, but that they are the birthright of all beings, and that in fact those states represent our most natural state. The state in which we sort of shed all of the egocentric, coverings of our vital energy. We shed our vanity, we shed our fear, we shed our ambition and our selfishness and our ultimately all of the various flavors of self-importance. We sort of get over all that, and that returns us to a state in which we can just be present with other beings and act from a place of kindness and openness and
Yeah. So when you are teaching, you are teaching a slightly different way comparing to the other teachers that we are having at Purple Valley, and I'm experiencing quite many of them. So we always start the classes with the Mysore practice, Ashtanga yoga, and then we always have a session with meditation and Pranayama. So do you feel that everyone can practice Pranayama? Or do you have to practice asanas for a certain time before you're ready for the breathing practices?
Well,
what is your
it's
opinion
just
about
not
that?
my nature to lay down any certain rules like this. I would highly advise anyone who is interested in pranayama to seek the guidance of someone who's been doing pranayama for many years and is in a daily way, in a really serious daily way, because there are signal dangers to practicing pranayama. One can easily, derange oneself. There are psychological dangers to practicing pranayama, but the main thing is that one has to do it with no ambition, with no sense of goal orientation, but if one does it really just as an exploration, and one does it very, very gently, which is the way that we do it here. We're teaching a very gentle, exploratory, contemplative form of pranayama, so that it becomes a contemplation on the breath, and hopefully one that leads into meditative states. And I think that, well, at least certainly all of the very sincere students who are showing up here and doing the asana practice are, they all seem to be getting a lot out of that. So.
And you are teaching the Ashtanga Pranayama, usually what is called the Ashtanga
not quite.
Pranayama.
I mean, no, not quite. There is an Ashtanga Pranayama, and it's very difficult.
And
so
how is it different from other pranayamas? Perhaps you can explain that as well.
Well, it's very demanding, that one. That sequence is very demanding, and that one is not just in our tradition. It's sort of not taught publicly, it's not taught widely, and I think for very good reason. And when it was taught to me, it was taught with the understanding that I would not teach it widely or publicly, and so I don't. But so the pranayama sequence that I am teaching is modeled in certain ways on that. It has formal similarities. It has some formal similarities, but it's also using certain Iyengar-inspired principles for beginning pranayama and applying those to make it safer for the lungs, safer for the mind, and more accessible. So, yeah.
And how do you think that the pranayama practice is affecting our body?
Well, I think the pranayama practice affects the body in exactly the same way as the asana practice does, because Ashtanga Vinyasa is a pranayama practice. It is a breathing practice, fundamentally, but it adds very dynamic movement to the movement of the breath. It allows the internal movements of the breath to be expressed outwardly in what is often quite strikingly dramatic movement, and allows the prana to be held in particular patterns that are defined by posture. So it's a very intricate form of pranayama, actually, the Ashtanga Vinyasa practice. And so then when we're sitting and doing pranayama like this, I mean, the basic psychology behind it, the kind of state that we're working with, and this process of hatha pika, it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same for the asana practice and the pranayama.
So do you think that the pranayama is also working on the pranic body? Excuse me.
On the pranic body?
Body, yeah.
Well, absolutely. And so what's what do we mean by the pranic body? I mean, the pranic body is just the sort of the sphere of consciousness that one can tap into in certain, meditative self-inquiry, in which one feels movements of creative force that are preconceptual and that also don't have the same kind of sort of visceral location and boundaries that physical sensations have. Okay, so it's not just feeling into the physical sensations of the body, but this more interesting thing happens where you start to feel these subtle currents of movement in the body. And of course they are sensations in a sense, but they seem somehow to be sort of moving on a different plane. But the fact is that the prana that one's feeling there, and the prana of sensation, and the prana of thought, and the prana of speech, and the prana of our visceral being are perfectly continuous, right? So what one is feeling is the creative force before it's fully condensed into these more visceral forms. Yeah.
So, do you think that the prana is somehow connected to our soul?
Our soul.
Yeah, or our spirit.
The soul can be nothing but prana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when the
so
prana
it's
leaves
said.
the body, basically, then we go.
Yeah, a certain kind of prana. Yes, this is right. Yeah,
Yeah.
leaves the body, and so it's said.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's
I
said.
won't pretend to be an expert
No,
on that.
no.
I try not to talk about things that I don't have
Yeah.
some
Yeah,
more
yeah, yeah,
immediate
yeah.
experience with. But so it's said, in the sort of, particularly in the tantric philosophy that and the tantric. I mean, I don't want to divide, make any. I don't mean to be heavy-handed with any kind of distinctions between tantric and Upanishadic or Vedic philosophy, but there are some interesting differences, and for sure, Ashtanga Vinyasa as a Hatha Yoga practice is more closely informed by tantric philosophy than Upanishadic philosophy. Although tantric philosophy comes out of Upanishadic philosophy, it's an extension of it. It's a it's in dialogue with it. It stands on its shoulders, etc. But in tantric philosophy, there's this idea that that prana has reality, has being in the very most fundamental sphere of reality, right? And that's at least a philosophical difference. Although I don't, whether or not that makes an actual difference to. It might make an actual difference to the way that one frames or conceptualizes one's experience. Does it make a difference to the kind of yoga that one can experience, in the context of these different philosophies? I'm skeptical of that. I think there's just one yoga, and there are 1,000 ways of experiencing it. And but in the tantric idea is that this prana was sort of was already sort of gently humming and vibrating in that absolute seed of consciousness, even before that urge to splinter and to manifest in a diversity of forms was before that arose. And of course, that is prana, right? Prana is that force of willing, that shakti. Called Icha Shakti, the Shakti of willing, the Shakti, and that's a manifestation of prana. So the prana is sort of always already there, just in an extremely rarefied and subtle form, and that it is continuously expressing its creative dynamism because that's its very nature. That's simply what it does. And consciousness is just the space in which that creative dynamism unfolds, right? And so the urge of consciousness to splinter into a diversity of forms just is the urge of consciousness to experience the spontaneous unfoldment of its own inherent creative powers, and then to revel in that, to revel in immediate awareness of that unfoldment eternally. And that revelry, according to the tantric philosophy, is this. It's life, it's experience, it's the experience of sentient beings, of all sentient beings. We're all participating in that revelry all the time. And the yoga is just about helping us wake up to that fact so that we can participate in the revelry consciously and with full awareness rather than sort of in a self-enclosed and darkened state.
Ty, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Carolina.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's really, really, really nice. So Ty will be coming back to Purple Valley next season. Yeah, in December, and hopefully we'll have one more chat. And now we are going to prepare for your last class. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.